Hi, friends. My name is Host Eric. I'm the host of Talking with Famous People. And I'd like to talk today about frame bondage, Framelock, being stuck in a place that's limiting a person's ontological scope and or inducing ontological distress. Okay? So this video idea was really prompted by me thinking some about a person in the chat named A Witness, who I believe to be a genuinely very religious person and somebody who probably came into the stream believing that he was doing God's work by evangelizing. But to make a long story short, he came around and talked with us and stuff, and continually stressed the need to not smoke weed and stuff if I wanted to be right with God. What I explained to him, what he kept saying is, hey, you know what? Christ will provide this thing that you're getting from that kind of thing, right? So, first of all, let me just say, a lot of non-religious people who are maybe raised rationalists or raised as an atheist like me, they tend to find actually religious people. I mean, do you have a lighter? Never mind, I'll get it. Never mind, don't worry about it. No problem. Because the religious person is very earnest, and it's easy to trip somebody like that up argumentationally because, well, I'll get to why in a bit. But the thing is, I don't believe he's trolling at all. I believe he's genuinely, earnestly a religious person who thinks that paradigm has the answers to everything, So, to continue forward here. The Framelock crisis. That's what the world is in right now, is a Framelock crisis. I want to explain exactly what that means and why it is the case. So, with A Witness, you got somebody who was absolutely not listening to what I was saying at all. When he said that Christ had the answer, I told him, I am a Christian. I'm already a Christian. You're preaching to the choir here. I'm very pleased with my relationship with God and Jesus. But from his perspective, I couldn't possibly have such a good relationship because I was engaging in intoxication. Now, so what does that tell us? First of all, we know that there's no inherent reason why getting loaded should be contrary to divinity. There's no good reason to accept that as a general heuristic. So basically, he's either doing one of two things. He's either projecting his own experience, saying, I used to be a drug user and an alcohol consumer, and then when I quit, I found Jesus, and now I don't need any drugs or alcohol anymore. Well, I also quit drinking alcohol, and that's when I became a Christian. But my deal with God was that I would get to keep doing all the other intoxicants that I want, just not alcohol. Now, obviously, there's no way that one individual can meaningfully tell another individual that individual's relationship with God is invalid based on the first individual's perceptions of what a relationship with God ought to look like. We can always critique a person's behaviors. So if he wants to say to me, you are doing bad because you are using violence against your wife, that'd be fine. You don't need God to tell me that, right? If you wanted to phrase it as, it's contrary to God's will that you be violent to your wife, I would agree with you. But again, we don't need to invoke God at all to understand that that's wrong, right? You can simply say, you're violating that person's rights when you use unprovoked violence against them. You are committing a crime, and you are engaging in wickedness, because you are violating the universal moral prohibition against infringing on another person's bodily integrity. and I could explain why it's a universal prohibition, etc. We don't need any God to accomplish that, okay? But what's more likely than, or it's equally likely to him projecting his own experience, is that he's simply in a state of frame bondage where he's locked into this one particular paradigm as the end all of paradigms and assumes that he's going to be able to deal with every single problem, every kind of issue in life, every matter that matters underneath that frame. So let's do an analogy here. I've got these notes here of a sports team. A sports team is a place where you need to have frame bondage. You got to have all the people on the team in it to win it, right? So that's why sports teams lend themselves to both magical thinking narratives and leadership faith. Let's say you got a basketball team and the coach is telling you guys, listen, the game we're playing this year, we're going to play very up-paced, fast tempo, a lot of full court press defense, and we're going to, 40 minutes of hell. Well, then if the team is going to win, it's going to need to execute that vision because that's the coach's vision. That's how the coach coaches. And hopefully he's got players who can play the way he wants to coach. Regardless, there's no good way to fight back against the singular vision for the team without doing further harm to the team. So you could also think of it in terms of magical thinking narratives like this team is destined. You can feel it. We won that game the last second in this miracle play. We won this one. We're a team of destiny. You could make those kind of statements too. But the point is, in a sports team, Framelock is fine. In fact, it's necessary because it's implied by the overarching paradigm of sports, which is competition. If you're in a zero-sum competition, your paradigm is, I want to win and not lose. So the frame is going to be fine for a frame to be singular and to lock you in, so to speak, in that context, because the paradigm is already constraining the scope of the thing to just the sports. Okay, so you could say that sports have a competition paradigm and a team frame, unless it's an individual sport. And your frame preference configuration is basically the same thing as another way of talking about your attentional configuration, because the kinds of frames you prefer for certain kinds of context is going to be determined by your attentional stack. The thing here, when I'm talking about frames and paradigms, I'm talking about paradigms being a level above frames, right? So a paradigm then is language, and people have one of two implicit frames in relationship to language. They see it as either therefore conveying information or therefore expressing themselves / attaining solvency. And what their attentional manner stack is like is going to be very determining of which of those two possible frames a given person approaches the paradigm of language with, So the thing is, there are lots of things that are implicitly understood by everybody in terms of frames and language that may not explicitly be understood by hardly anybody. And one of the things that's implicitly understood by everybody is that if you want others to agree with you, you need to make justifications that meet external standards. And this is why you'll see religious people engaging in the very ridiculous practice of trying to argue that reason, logic, and evidence are why one ought to believe in God rather than faith. So the reason that they're doing that is because they understand implicitly, without having thought about it at all probably, that in order to get another person to agree with you, you have to make justifications that meet external, not internal standards. Like, I'm not going to convince you to believe in God by saying, well, I feel it in my heart. If you had my heart, you'd feel it too. Well, I don't have your heart, so I don't feel it too, so that's what's going to be the response to that. Instead, if they want you to agree with them, they try to make arguments to say the rational position on something is this magical thinking frame, which is obviously self-contradictory. So there are lots of different kinds of frames. I've listed a few here: advocacies, affirmations, and negations. Affirmations are resolutions to change the status quo. Negations are responses to such affirmations in defense of the status quo. You've got frames like behaviors, like jogging. Nobody thinks much about jogging as having a frame because frames are most commonly relevant when dealing with language stuff. But the fact that you don't need any kind of frame is the frame for something like jogging. I don't need to justify it. I just feel like doing it. It might be good for me. I can have my own justifications, but they're individual justifications. There's no reason why anybody else should go jogging if maybe they prefer swimming, Maybe they prefer sitting around. Magical thinking frames include things like astrology, numerology, religion, etc. Solvency frames, they start with what you want or what your problem is and end at how to get it or how to solve it. And a dialectic frame is like an advocacy frame, except it's not adversarial. And then lastly, the frame listed here, the pedagogical frame, which is kind of the frame that I like to operate under. I want to explain things to you. I want to teach things. But what I'm not really doing is teaching anything concrete. I'm explaining how the world is and how language is and what people are doing and why they're doing it when they're doing it. So anyway, the real question then becomes on this kinds of frame issue is, are you an agent of and for yourself or of and for everybody? That's going to be basically, are you an experiential agent or a communicative agent? My preferred frame obviously is communication. It's pedagogical, and it's an extension of a dialectic frame. While I've done plenty of adversarial rhetoric kind of stuff, I vastly prefer dialectic, which is to say, using language for the purpose of parsing away incorrectnesses and explaining correctly such that understanding occurs. So at this point, I'd like to talk about the difference between explanations and archetypes. Much of what we encounter when we're talking about stuff that we talk about around, we're talking with famous people, personality type stuff anyway, people talk in terms of archetypes. Kiersey will call this person the savior, this person is the savior type. The performer. That's literally an archetype as you can get, right? But astrology, numerology, enneagram, those are other examples of archetype-based frames, which I won't call frames of understanding, but rather frames of knowing, okay? Frames underneath knowing, the paradigm of knowing. And then Jonathan Haidt is another example of archetypes. Big Five, IQ, ADHD, Asperger's syndrome. All these things are archetypal kinds of epistemics versus explanations, which are understanding kinds of epistemics. Cognitive functions, as I presented, is an explanation. It is not an archetypal thing. And this is where we get to a key distinction that needs to be made between knowing and understanding. A witness is an example of somebody who's doing all knowing and no understanding. It doesn't matter that I tell him I'm a Christian. He doesn't accept it because he knows that Christians don't smoke pot. So ultimately, it's about respecting lanes. Knowing affords the knower certainty in the absence of an explanation. That certainty might be wrong, but that's what knowing is. I intuitively know and am certain that or I remember clearly and therefore I'm certain that I mad. So it's great to be proficient in knowing so long as you recognize that certain things can and should and must be known. Other things should not and be known and can and must be understood to be optimal in any way, for correctness sake, So, religious faith, your relationship with God, is something that can only be known, not explained. Same thing with astrology. You can know what it means to be a Virgo, but you can't explain it, because to have an explanation, there needs to be a mechanism that you can apply independent of your sleight of hand stuff that you're doing with, okay, well, yeah, you're not like a Taurus, but that's because your moon is over here. It's that kind of shit, Art's another thing that you can only know, you cannot understand. I have to use intuition that's not very front stack for me. So in other words, very long way around, labor intensive, try out a bunch of shit and hope that I happen upon something worth something. Then my NI says, that, right? That's knowing. I can't understand why exactly that's great and this rest of this shit I've been doing is crap, but it is. And there's nothing wrong with knowing. For many things, it's the only way to have an epistemological relationship with something is to know it. You cannot understand lots of things. On the other hand, there are plenty of things you can understand. So the things that make me mad are things like Big Five, IQ tests, Jonathan Haidt, because at least with astrology and numerology, nobody should take them seriously because they don't present themselves as things that should be taken seriously. But Jonathan Haidt's values thing here, this is a kind of sloppy nonsense that happens when you don't operate correctly from the outset in terms of understanding things and explaining things. He says the values include things like purity, sanctity, care, harm, fairness, cheating, loyalty, betrayal, authority, subversion, liberty, oppression. Those things are not values as people experience values. People experience values as either instrumental or absolute. It's true that Rachel has fairness as an absolute value for her. I have it as an instrumental value for me, which is to say, I am consistently fair, reasonable, honest in my discourse because it's my way of going about business, but not because it's an end in itself. For Rachel, it's an end in itself. If we do not understand values as being either instrumental or absolute, then we don't understand values at all. Additionally, something like loyalty, betrayal. Everybody's going to value loyalty from people that they are very close to and trust a great deal, and are going to be devastated by betrayal by those same people. When you're trying to position this as a value, what you're saying is, oh, when I'm looking outside in the world, I'm valuing the sight of someone being loyal or something. And that's another problem with this kind of value taxonomy, is we not only have instrumental and absolute values, but we have values that are absolute for ourselves. In other words, a scorecard function like extroverted feeling, for me, it's an absolute value. I know I'm happy when I'm getting points in that area, right? And then I also have a scorecard for the rest of the external world, the fifth slot function. If somebody in the external world has shitty NI or uses NI badly, which is bad effect, or just totally lacks it like Dave Matthews or Kamala Harris, then I'm going to have no respect for those people. So to correctly understand values is to first and foremost understand attentional manners and to understand how certain values correlate with those depending on where they are in the stack, Anyway, to wrap this up, the consequences, the damage done by Framelock can be seen with a witness. So he's got his identity linked to this idea that he's basically at peace, free, maybe not enlightened, but something like that, because he's got right with God. And trouble. What we end up seeing is that when he's asked to listen and understand something rather than know from either his own experience or his intuition, the kind of he's locked into this single God magical thinking frame, trying to force it to be a paradigm rather than a frame, right? And his entire worldview rather than a frame. When he's observing things that call into question that frame, it really disrupts his sense of like spiritual Zen master religious guy, and he even gets a little spiteful. This is because he's frustrated. He's not seeing in me what he wants to see, which is somebody who's suffering or lacking in some way because I'm not experiencing God as he thinks it can only be experienced. What's the solution? Well, the solution is the same thing it's been for this entire time. People need to listen to Eric. Thanks for watching. See you later. What? Yeah, I'm making this is a video I'm uploading, not a live stream.